Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining today's session in which we're going to be looking at covering the Learning Outcome 3 on the unit that we are currently studying, which is Introduction to Emerging Technologies. Now, just before I start, as always, let's look at the unit specification and the indicative content which is primarily given in this particular unit specification sheet. This is also upon Moodle. That's the first document that you normally see when you go into the unit. So just to switch over to Moodle, as you can see, obviously that's the first document here, which I've opened up, and it should allow you to, basically this is a document that we normally use, which allows us to inform, in terms of what is to be taught and what is to be covered in the learning outcome. So just a bit of a refresh, this document, which I'm going to be using today to discuss Learning Outcome 3. So what we've done is we've covered, some basic background into understanding, what are the emerging technologies in Learning Outcome 1. We looked at some of the key, emerging technologies coming up like robotics, artificial intelligence. We looked at social media, digital technology. In Learning Outcome 2, we are now focusing on one of the facets of digital technology which is coming up, which is AI. And in this session, I've covered with examples things like a basic AI that we get to see today on, voice telephony. When you call up an office or a business organization, you go through a number of steps. If you've called the switchboard, and sometimes when you use Amazon and other bits, you'd see artificial intelligence being used when you're contacting the Amazon assistant, and he or she actually tries to take you through a number of options before they put you onto a customer service executive. So Learning Outcome 2 was all about understanding artificial intelligence, its background, its history, where it's come from, how it is going forward. And, in terms of some of the discussions that we've done on that, we basically looked at covering, details in terms of who was the father of, let's put it this way, artificial intelligence, and the programming side of language. When we talk about, in general, how they've come about, we get to see that, this was a bit of when we look at basically emerging technologies and we talk about how it all started, we basically look at a combination of four things, which is primarily looking at heuristic language programming. We look at a bit of machine learning, and then that has gone into further developments with the say for example the use of deep learning and natural language processing, and that has given rise to the context of, artificial intelligence. We also looked at, the father of artificial intelligence is the English mathematician Alan Turing, and he's credited with starting something off in the early 1950s. And, we see that this has now developed into a full-fledged technology, which is currently now leading the way in a lot of applications, situations and, businesses and, let's put it this way, applications that we get to use on a day-to-day basis. Now, in the third learning outcome, we are going to be looking at understanding essentially what are the, implications of change in technology within an organization. So we've got a couple of assessment criteria that we want to look at, which is all in the PASS criteria. And here, the idea is this particular learning outcome is a bit theoretical because it says understand the implications. So we are looking at theoretically understanding how change is introduced in the organization, what are the various change models which have come up over the years and have become, frameworks or models that most companies, organizations, businesses use to bring about change within the organization. In addition to covering, the basic aspects of change and the basic frameworks, what we want to do is contextualize the understanding of what we are studying, which is change and how it is introduced within the organization. But the context is going to be technology, because we are obviously reading and studying an IT qualification. So what we want to do is how does change get introduced in the IT department, or how does the IT department essentially introduce change within the organization? That's the whole essence of understanding Learning Outcome 3. And we'll be looking at briefly some of the 5 assessment criteria which are given, and we'll get into that with a set of slides and presentation that I've prepared. There are a couple of videos and there are a couple of articles and reading, let's say, journals and articles that I put up on the Moodle website under this particular handout, presentation. And they would, if you read them, they would give you additional information into what and how change is introduced. So practical examples of how to manage change, what is change management, what is emerging technology, and why change is required in the organization, and what are the regulations which are coming in primarily when we talk about, understanding change, which the technological side of things bring across in an organization. So there are some additional handouts for additional reading, which will obviously put some meat on the bones in the sense that they'll give you some more details about what we're going to be looking at covering through the presentation slides and short videos in our discussion today. So let's get on with it in terms of understanding, there are lots of bits that we need to look at. So bits like need for change, which is the first assessment criteria, change impact analysis. How do we look at the impact of changing technology within the organization, and what kind of an impact can it have on productivity, efficiency, employee morale, and, in general, staff turnover in some cases. Look at methods of implementing change. This is where we'll basically be looking at understanding, bits and pieces on what are the change models that we get to, understand them. And then in the next one, we're looking at doing a bit of research on the emerging technologies. What are the various technologies which are coming up, which a lot of organizations are embracing today, things like CRM, artificial intelligence, automation. We look at some of them. And then we consider, what an organization needs to look into before they actually look at, implementing this change. Because not everybody is receptive to accepting change in the organization. So from that context, what we want to be able to do is phase out change within the organization, look at some of the basic steps through which change can be implemented so that people do not, or employees and staff do not have resistance or show resistance to that change. And if we get resistance from change, then how does the organization go about tackling that resistance would be all covered in today's discussion. Now, as always, I will start off with some key terminology. So when we look at the Learning Outcome 3, what we want to do is the Learning Outcome 3 talks about understanding the implications of change in technology. So the first question that I would want to ask is, what is technological change? So what is change essentially? Change is, how do we define technological change? So when we look at economics, in the case of economics, if you look at the definition of technological change, it basically defines this increase in the efficiency of a product or a process that results in the increase in the output without increasing the input required to produce that output. As you understand, all businesses, today have inputs and they produce some outputs. So if you look at a car manufacturing company, the input going in is a lot of raw material, mechanics, other bits into it. And then you basically look at, the other side of things, which is to understand how this would be, bringing that change in to increase efficiency and productivity, but without incurring a lot of other costs, which are costs which would require to increase the input, would be defined as technological change, if we look at the definition economically. Now, a simple example that I would give you here is, if I give you a different perspective, is that if you look at telephone, that we use on a day-to-day basis, we use landline and we use a mobile phone. Now, that product, if you look at over the years, has undergone a lot of change. We did not have mobiles. We had, what are called landlines or phones, and they were the rotary phones that we normally had, dial the number through the dial. Then we had the keypad phones, then cordless phones came in the office, and now we have one base and a couple of handsets that you can put across in different rooms, different places. And then over the years, what we've also seen is that some part of this function has gone into voice over telephony, VoIP, or internet protocol. And as you see, this technological change which has happened in this one product segment, which is telephone. We didn't have mobile phones before 1990. Or at least we had them for military purposes and usages, but as the technology has become more affordable, more compact, concisable, and in the sense it has become more affordable for consumers, you see mobile phone and mobile telephony increasing more than landlines. So there are 1.3, 1.4 billion phones which are sold every year, and you see how that device has become a device that has come into the palm of our hands. So obviously in this stage, when we look at technological change, there are lots of things which have happened. And if I classify that into three different parts, you would normally see that there is, when you look at the introduction of a new product, it is normally done through the process of invention. That means new product technology or, new usages of technology or products are created, and that is classed as invention. Then you look at innovation. So if you had a big phone, when the battery runs out, but over the years, as companies have been working to introduce from nickel cadmium to lithium ion batteries, you see there's a bit of an innovation which has been brought in, which is that the use of lithium-ion batteries has doubled the life of hand phones, essentially, from the time they were introduced. So this is an innovation. So improvement into the existing products that have been introduced for the first time, which is invention, but improvements on those products which bring across changes for better, utilization, or for the purposes of making things better, then they would be termed as innovation. Sometimes they are used, also introduced first time, and that will be called innovation. And then we look at diffusion, how fast others begin to adapt that innovation. So when you see initially when the mobile phone were brought out, they were bought out by companies like Motorola, you look at Ericsson, Sony, Samsung, but over the years, as we have seen, is a lot of companies have got into this product and they have started to replicate or bring across similar offerings, and that process is called diffusion. So when we talk about technological change, I want to be quite clear here is that it is required because from an economic point of view, when you look at a business, an organization, unless we're looking at a charity which is separate, but if you look at most businesses and organizations which are running for making profits, or returning, dividends to their shareholders, things like that. From an economic perspective, you would look at that if a new product, service, process is introduced, and that introduces and brings across the introduction of that process, product, whatever that may be in terms of whether it's a process or it's a product, the introduction of that actually brings across, changes in the organization, and those changes could be defined into changes in terms of efficiency, productivity, requiring less input, requiring decrease in the bill of material cost, or at least decreasing the inputs which are required to produce the output, would be then called a technological change. And an example that I've given you is a telephone, and when you look at how it has evolved over the years, and that very clearly specifies, that this is how it needs to be done. So what you need to do is, in terms of understanding technological change, what we also need to do is, let's look at a bit of a video. And that video basically gives us an example of, how we look at technological change, what are the definitions of it, how does it impact, organizations, and what could be the examples that we want to look at.
Peloton, hold on to it.
So let me just get rid of this advert, and I'll switch you over to have a look at this particular video. So this is a video that I've chosen specifically because what you need to do is we need to basically, look at the aspect of, Amazon store, Amazon Go store, which basically, has been introduced, and Amazon is now getting into the grocery and the fast food consumer side of market, wherein what they're looking at is introducing stores wherein there are no checkout, no tills, and customers can walk in with their smartphone and essentially walk out, and automatically calculates what you bought and how much you need to pay and things like that. So let me restart this video from the beginning, and let's look at the Amazon Go store, which has been introduced as Amazon is currently doing a pilot scheme in some locations. So this is the US in which they've launched a couple of stores in New York, and let's look at watching this video. So I'm going to stop the video here, and obviously then let's discuss in terms of what we have noticed on this particular video. Now, if you see, there are a couple of things that we have noticed. One is that you see a lot of customers actually scanning an Amazon app or a barcode when they enter the store. The second is when they browse the shelves, they are able to pick up products, whether it's sandwiches, juices, whatever they're picking up. And then what they do is after they've picked up what they need, they actually, sign out or go out from the store from a particular direction. Now, if you visualize, what are the technologies which are being used here? So if I look at the video carefully and understand, one of the first things that I see is that the technology which is being used is that it is using an application which is on a mobile phone. It is using an RFID or a barcode basis technology which allows the machine or the PC to register that so you are walking in, and it passes on some identity details in the background to that machine. The third thing is using location-based technology, which is integrated in your phone. The store has certain sensors and areas which have been clearly defined, and using the location-based, technology on your phone, the store and the sensors or, the layout of the store is able to pick out where you're standing, in which section of the store you are in. And when you pick up certain material from certain trays, or from certain shelves and racks, what you will see is that they also have some sensors on it. So if you pick up something, it reduces the weight maybe, or it forwards a counter, and that informs the store and the back end of the system that this has been picked up. And because you're standing in front of it using a location-based technology and the phone that you have in your pocket, as you can see, they don't even need to take out the phone, scan anything. It is able to detect that this product has been bought. Now, all the products in the store have RFID on it. So if a product is picked up and it starts walking, its location starts changing, and you see the checkout happening, that means the person is actually walking out from the checkout. That means that the person has taken that particular product with him, and then that gets billed back to the customer. So if you see here, there are lots of technologies which are at play. One, you look at barcode or RFID. You look at location-based technology. You look at artificial intelligence. You look at, automatic inventory dispensing and calculation. And then when you're walking out, using again location-based, it is doing a checkout automatically for the customer, generating a receipt and sending it to the phone or to the email of the customer saying, you bought these products, and that is where it basically, starts off. So from our point of view, what you need to look at is understand that these are the bits which are changing in technology when we look at, things which are, that we need to understand in this learning outcome. Okay, so from our point of view, what we need to be able to do is, using this bit of video that we have seen, we need to build some of our understanding and discuss some of the assessment criteria. So let's look at some of them which essentially, are happening. Now, the first one, explain the need for change. Now, why do we need to change? What are the reasons why changes are happening? There's a fundamental background to this which we need to look into, and these tend to be, over the years as modernization is happening. If you look at the industrial revolution in the 17th and the 18th century, the coming in of the steam engine, then the coming in of the phone and things like that, you've seen that as new innovations have come about, they have generally helped the mankind or humans in particular to be more efficient, to do more in terms of transactions or to do more in terms of operations. So when we look at, need for change could be defined in terms of, the basic bits that we talked about, whether it happens because of the invention, it happens because of innovation, or in some cases, when we look at mass adaptation of the technology, which is to do with consumerization of technology, you would see that then that process leads to what is called diffusion. So here in this particular, assessment criteria 3.1, we need to be able to explain what is the need for change. So need for change tends to be that it is going to be related to how things are progressing, products and services are evolving, and how innovations are being brought across into any sector, and that is what is driving the need for change. Now, when we talk about innovation, when we talk about invention, and we talk about diffusion, what we also need to be able to do is relate that with a bit of example. So when you look at the CD, initially the compact disc which came out, was having a capacity, and they obviously it made a lot of things easier because storage got increased from your pen drives and flash drives. You could suddenly store 700 gig or 700 megabytes of data on a compact drive or compact disk. Now, the innovations in that product category tended to happen, and what we have seen is that as the demand for storage and media increased, the industry did or created a new product, and that was the DVD, digital video player or disc. And in this case, the DVD was able to store up to 4 gigabytes of data. That meant that if I was looking at having songs on a compact drive or CD, I could store maybe 10, 12, 13 songs. But when it came about that I wanted to store more songs and movies, and then the DVD came out as an innovation, and that allows us to watch a full movie or a couple of hundred songs on a particular disc, and that was a case of innovation. So what has driven that innovation? What has driven that change? The change has been driven by our increased need for storage and the data portability that we wanted to have. So have music in our cars, on our disc players, have it on our CD players, cassette players, things like that. And that was driving the demand for change. And this is an example of how we see that storage demand in terms of the amount of capacity, gigabytes and megabytes. And so it was kilobytes initially, then it went to megabytes, then it was gigabytes. The demand for storage and storage media has essentially the creation of these products from CD to DVD. Now in the DVDs, we also have a DVD which is rewritable. So you have R1 which is readable, then you have RW, that means it's rewritable, and then you have RWR, that means it's rewritable as well. So that you can erase the disk and you can rewrite or upload more data and content on it. And that is basically being driven by innovation, and innovation being driven by the demand the consumer segment has, for the purposes of say for example for multi-usage of that category or that product, and in some cases the demand for storing more media onto or more songs being stored onto, for example, the disk. So I've looked at a couple of slides here, and what I've done in the slides is basically taken you through an example of how changes come about by looking at the first industrial revolution. Then we talked about certain changes which were introduced in the first industrial revolution in the 18th century, actually brought across technological change wherein a lot of these mechanical devices were being substituted by machines. So when you look at repetitive functions which were happening in production and engineering within large factories, they were being replicated by mechanical devices which were able to do and take over some of these instructions as one time, from say for example feeding in through the instructions and then repeatedly doing those, which basically meant that the humans or labor in terms of people working within within those factories then could start to do some of the other types of functions within that because of that change. So mechanization essentially. Then we talk about how, for example, over the years, what we've seen is automation being brought into the same aspect of it. And when we talk about, technology and technological change happening, some of the technological change that we get to see, which gets introduced in factories or production engineering companies, is that they basically are being introduced as innovation to increase and drive efficiency or in terms of producing more products. Now, one of the examples that you look at is, if I show you an example of, Heinz factory. We all eat beans, baked beans. Now, if I look at, how the baked beans are essentially produced, and if we look at the video production of how that is done, primarily, in, say, for example, in the factory here in Wigan, you would generally see that, so if I look at just bringing that over, one second. So if I look at this particular video and show you an example.
Are you so ready? Go with Groupon.
I do. Hope you've got rain in the head. Can't deal with stupidity.
So if I look at this now, this is just an example of what I want to show you in terms of, the Heinz factory. Now, beans were introduced as a canned product, during the World War I. primarily for military and soldiers so that they could carry some food and ration. But over the years, this product, which was created by the US military, has now become, synonymous, and we use beans every day. And obviously cans have been used every day. So when you look at, how they are produced and how the factories are producing it, you would normally see an automation being introduced in this factory every now and then to improve efficiency and productivity. Now, this factory, I think, if I recall, basically produces about 1 million cans every day. Now, in order to serve the demand, consumer demand globally, what you have to do is some of this technology which is being introduced in the plant in terms of automation is being done primarily under the general purpose technology, which is primarily to bring across a technical change in the factory in order to increase efficiency, in order to increase when I say efficiency, what I mean by that is in order to basically increase the number of cans or output being produced by the factory. Now, there's a demand of, I think 1.8 billion cans every month. Now, if the factory has to produce these many number of cans, one is the company can open a number of factories, and the other would be to increase efficiency of some of these factories in places which allows them to produce more from the same facility. And in some cases, this factory in Wigan essentially runs 3 shifts. So basically, they are looking at producing 650 cans every shift, and they can produce up to, if required, 1.8 million cans every day. Now, this change that we generally get to see, which is happening, so I'll just stop the video here and I'll take you back to the slides. So if I look at this particular change which is being done in terms of technology, is primarily to increase the capacity which the factory is able to produce cans in, and this is under the general purpose technology, GPT. And this particular innovation which is being brought across into lots of different sectors that we get to see. So for example, the internal combustion engine, the cars, when they were introduced in the early 19th century by Ford, you look at they could only travel so long a distance. The horsepower in the car was very minimal. Some of the bits over the years have been refined, and what we see is modern cars today which are capable of producing 1000 bhp, and they go from 0 to 60 or 0 to 100 miles in 2 or 3 seconds. Now, this has been upgrades to the existing technology, and the reason why this has happened is because of innovation and invention and demand from the consumer. And these changes are classified as general purpose technological changes, which are basically increasing the efficiency, output, or productivity in those particular sectors. Now, when we look at some of the other side of changes which are being brought across. So when we see some of those changes being brought across, these changes are being brought across primarily because they are going to be leading to adoption of technology by masses. In some cases, it is bringing the cost down because this will allow masses to be able to adapt technology and use them on a daily basis to become, say, more efficient, more productive, or make it easier for them to do certain daily chores. And in some cases, this is also leading to what is called mass production of products, which is the available supermarkets. And in those cases, this is making technology accessible to people across the globe. And that is what tends to drive, this particular technological change. Now, a question to you would be to look at thinking about some of the new industries which have grown or have come about once the PC and the internet became affordable or accessible by masses. So you think of things like, when internet became more affordable and it, is now accessible to, say, 3 billion people across the globe, you would generally see that it brings across information sharing, better communication, quicker, sharing of data or information and knowledge. And in some cases, you see this change being reflected by the changes of, device that is being used to access the internet. So most developing, underdeveloped countries maybe are still using PCs. But if you look at developing and developed countries, they're using tablets and phones increasingly to access that data, because the mobile telephony side of things, in developed countries is now, looking at implementation of 5G, which would mean 1 gigabyte per second speed available through mobile networks to be able to download, stream, watch, consume data, movies, music, whatever it is. So some of these changes are being driven by consumerization, demand from the consumer side. They're also being driven by changes which are happening within the sector and the industry, innovations being brought across. So if you look at one of the basic things that we use at home is the wireless router. Now, when we introduced the wireless router, or when it was introduced early in the 2000s, you saw that the wireless spectrum was essentially, G, which was 2.5 gigahertz. Now, after that, you have A and B, which came out. So ABG. Today, you have a different spectrum available, and that allows, the transmission of signal to be done more effectively without loss, and increases the speed, to as high as 1 terabyte using wireless routers in certain locations or within offices and, within premises. You look at the same innovation which has pretty much happened because of the demand, and that is primarily when you get to see the number of devices being connected at home. So there is a need for change because people are embracing technology, people are embracing automation, and automation in general is helping getting things done, more easily. One of the things that you would get to see is that if you go back 50, 60 years, there were traditional banks, but then when money was supposed to be dispensed and the banks were closed, ATMs was introduced. They were introduced in the 70s and 80s as a add-on to banking. And then you look at the percolation of internet, and you have online banking now available. And then when you look at, onwards of 2010, 2012, when phone networks became much more efficient and much more stable and faster, you have the app-based banking, which is now available. And these are all examples of innovation, how you can quickly bank and do banking transactions without having to go to the physical bank. And this is what is driving change. So you could look at, a lot of different things like why are we looking at replacing old technology? This is as well repaired. The device isn't repairable. They are beyond repair. In some cases, when you upgrade your PCs, you think of upgrading because the PC has become very slow. The hard drive is full. You look at some of the accessories don't work. And in some cases, when you look at laptops and tablets, the batteries drain quite quickly and they cannot be changed. So that is also looking at why technological change tends to happen within organization. And there is a good article that you should read, which is a blog which says why we need to replace old technology. And that gives you a perspective of why change needs to be brought across. Now, let's look at the second criteria, which is carry out change impact analysis. Now, when change has to be introduced within the organization, what we need to look at is how is it going to impact the organization. So in organization, you look at staff, employees, processes, systems. We look at all those in terms of the measurement of impact of change if something is to be introduced or something has to be upgraded. Now, let's look at some good and bad ways, or, pros and cons, or both sides of the technological change and what kind of an impact it can have. Now, generally, when you look at changes being brought across, and I'll stick to an example of PC. So if you look at if most organizations, when they change PCs every 5, 6, maybe 10 years, is because in the past, the operating system of Windows was, Microsoft was changing. Windows was being upgraded. You had Windows essentially 9, when it started 3.1, then you had Windows 95, Windows 98, then you had Windows 2000, Windows Millennium, then you had Windows Vista, you had Windows 7, and today we use Windows 10. So if you see from the time the company has started in the 1970s, 75, 76, they've had maybe 7, 8 versions of Windows which have been brought across. Now, every time an organization looks at upgrading, Windows XP was also there, which was very popular. So when you look at these new versions or variants of products being introduced, the reason why they want to upgrade is they want to increase efficiency. They want to do in the office. You want productivity to happen. You want more and more software and features to work on the system. And that is where essentially, you would see that this particular bit, can impact the organization. Now, sometimes when you work as an IT manager, you look at certain things like, okay, if we change the PCs, currently, an example would be a PC takes about, say, a new PC takes about 40, 45 seconds to, say, for example, boot up. Now, in some cases, if you see that the old PC with Windows XP takes 2 minutes to boot up, then how much time is being lost in terms of restarting the PC, and how does it affect, the employee working within the organization? Now, if these machines have become old, are not usable, they cannot be connected to devices, there are, updates not coming from Microsoft, or in some cases it opens up more vulnerabilities in the operating system than it provides advantages, then in those cases what you will look at is that it is better for us to be able to change that system or change those systems in a particular office branch location, because that would allow one, security to be addressed, issues on security to be addressed, would look at definitely making the employees work better because they get a new machine, faster machine, productivity would increase, and obviously you're doing away with an IT side of things which is non-compatible with your networks internally. So when you look at carrying out change within the organization, all this has to be planned. And the planning side of things tends to happen when you look at new processes, new products. You look at what are the benefits these products can bring across. In this case, a PC, you look at what are the new variants of the PC or the operating system available. How does it affect efficiency? What does it cost? Even if it costs more, does it cover the cost over a period of time? Because the employees are going to be more efficient and productive, and generally the morale of the employees are going to be better because they're using fast machines, and communication would become more effective or faster. How does it solve some of the existing problems in terms of where it doesn't connect to network, or drivers have to be updated too frequently, security patches have to be applied, things like that. And then does it decrease reliance on IT department to be able to solve those problems when problems do occur? So troubleshooting, can it be done remotely on some machines? Can it then adapt to the infrastructure which the organization is deployed? So all these things have to be considered when you introduce something in terms of a change within the organization. Now, some of the negative aspects that you consider that it would do is that when you look at negative aspects of technology, what we get to see is that a lot of young millennials are using social media quite heavily. They're using texting quite heavily. Some of these technological changes which were not there earlier, were in some ways we say were better, because if we didn't have access to these devices, obviously, some part of the personal stress, strain on eyes, and obviously overusage of the devices and applications that is putting onto the human body could have been avoided. So some of these could be the negative effects, although technology always benefits, but at some stage these could be negative effects of technology that we get to see, which is wherein it is increasing productivity and efficiency, no doubt, but it is also making us more dependent on technology. It is also making us more addicted to technology, and those could be some of the negative effects that we need to consider when we implement a change within the organization. The third assessment criteria essentially talks about how do we look at change affecting people. Now here, if we look at change affecting people, we are looking at basically understanding that in some cases when we look at change can be brought across or can affect people if they work in isolation. In some cases, if they work without interaction. And in some cases, like when we look at the impact of COVID, a lot of employees were working from home. Children in particular didn't go to school. They were missing out on the social interaction side of things. And here in this case, more and more interaction was being done predominantly or facilitated by PCs, Zoom sessions, and some sort of webinars and remote sessions which were done between the school and the children. So in this case, what has happened is that the overuse of technology in some cases has basically negatively impacted children, because they missed out on the social interaction side of things, which is very key to the development of their personality. And in terms of context that we look at from an organizational point of view, sometimes you would see that these technological changes can affect people because there is a difficult learning curve for some of the members or staff within the organization who are not able to easily adapt to that change. So if I introduce Windows and I was more using Windows 7 or Windows XP, that is a bit of a jump. And if I have to be successful in terms of adapting to that change, the organization needs to be able to facilitate training, which would allow me to understand the differences which have got created from the previous version of Windows and to the new version of Windows. In some cases, if I don't get an upgrade to a machine and the machine becomes too slow, the PC becomes too slow, then it leads to more of frustration, saying that one, I've been given a slow machine or a PC. Second, the operating system is something which is a bit of a new beast to me, and obviously I don't understand how to work on Windows 10. And last but not the least, it makes it difficult for people to be able to get on with things. And at some stage, what tends to happen is they start losing their morale and the interest, and that basically leads to other effects like decreasing productivity, staff leaving the organization, work not getting done, and conflicts and other things. So in this case, what we need to do is how does it impact people? When we talk about this particular learning outcome, we are going to be looking at, how does technology help, let's say, do better or effective communication, and in some cases, over usage of technology, how can it negatively lead or harm the individual from a people's perspective. So, for example, in most organizations, you see you have certain types of laws and requirements wherein if you're going to be sitting in front of the PC for long hours, then obviously infrastructurally the office or the employer should be able to provide you a comfortable chair and a desk, and an adequate distance need to be maintained so that you do not have adverse effect on your eyes. Regular breaks are prescribed, and also certain bits in terms of when we look at typing on the keyboard. Breaks are prescribed because people have started to develop what are called the metatarsal syndromes, when your fingers actually begin to ache because you do a lot of typing on the keyboard. So some of these factors can affect people within the organization, and that is where sometimes you look at HR doing the job rotation side of things. So if you've been working within a call center and you take a lot of calls, after a point in time, you are normally rotated and you're given a different function or a different job to do in order to ensure that you are not having any negative effects of making so many calls, or the dialer putting in so many calls, and working through the system, or being in front of the PC for 8 hours and things like that. And sometimes these reasons for change which happen could be classified as changes which I would put it as pestle. There are political changes, legal changes, sociological change, socio-technological changes, economical changes, and these changes can happen in the external environment of the organization. Because that meant that when the pandemic hit, what that changed was lockdowns. And obviously, when lockdowns happened, staff and employees were expected to work from home. Obviously, we are all keen to go to the office and work from the office, but in some cases, some organizations had to make provisions to be able to run these side of things then from home, and they enable things like telephone calls, and devices, PCs, laptops, and things like that. And one of the examples the company Google did was it allocated $1,000 to each of its employees to work from home in the entire year in 21, and that facilitated this payment for them to be able to buy a PC, desk, or some of the basic things that were required for them to work from home, so that they could work comfortably, and that should not have a negative impact on the productivity and output which is required from the employee working within the organization. So some of these bits, that we need to look at from a people's perspective. So we look at one of the arguments of psychology. We look at some of the bits in terms of understanding, how psychology and, what psychology says today is that when we look at newer technologies which are being led by internet and digital technology in particular, they are shaping the way we think. And, if we go back to this particular, they're shaping the way we think. And, there are subtle differences, which are being introduced in our judgment. And this is going to have a long-term impact on how people actually deal, transact, build relationships, or interact with other, colleagues or peers within the organization. So essentially, when we talk about some of the changes, how it impacts people within the organization because of technology, we look at attention. I was able to remember all the phone numbers. We used to have address diary, up until the 90s, but that's all disappeared, and everything today is now dependent, wherein you have to even look at your phone to be able to remember some of the key numbers that you need to call. And that has made us dependent on the technology. Some part of decision making we also look at is being done now by technology for us. So if you go to moneysupermarket.com, or if you go to, for example, comparethemarket.com, you're looking at these websites which basically are able to, when you create a profile, you go in and you say, I want to buy this car, or I want to buy that insurance policy. These websites are having programs and algorithms which allow them to scan lots of different types of offers, and they can then put that across to you on one screen, which allows you to help in taking a decision that, okay, if I take this insurance out, I will be saving that money, and these are all the prices which all the other companies are offering. So it is helping us in decision making. This is also helping us in relationship building. So when we look at some statistics, there are 2.9 billion people, who are basically connected to some form of social media, whether it was Facebook, Twitter, the loads of it, through YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram. But there were about almost 3 billion people which were connected to the social media. How did it affect us in terms of our relationship building? Today we get to see a typical example in every home is that when you're sitting for dinner, everybody has their devices next to it. They're all sitting, they're having dinner, they're all, as a part of the family. Sometimes you see they're all busy in their own circles and they're not bothered in terms of the family sitting together to have a dinner or a meal at the end of the day. So in this way, if I look at a personal example would be that, okay, when we look at people sitting down and, using technology, this is a bit of a negative effect. It is happening on the social and media interactions or, social interactions within the family, wherein people are ignoring, relationships and obviously close contacts. And sometimes you see you are sitting in one room in the house and obviously you're texting your wife in the other room saying that, could you bring this over or could you bring that over? So this has made us so dependent on technology that in a way this is having a bit of a negative effect. And I give you the example of, remembering numbers when we used to have the interest diary and things like that. Again, it has made us dependent on them. And some of the bits that we were able to memorize earlier, today we have to look at being dependent on technology, do a bit of a search on the phone to remember the number and things like that. So it is affecting how we record, transact, and remember things, and that is related to the memory side of things as far as the personal aspect or people aspect is concerned. Quickly looking at some of the change models now, wherein the 3.4 assessment criteria talks about explained methods of implementing change. Now, over the years, there has been a lot of research studies which have been done in change management, how change is evolving as a discipline, and how change is introduced within the organization. There are two very significant models that we want to look at. One is John Cotter's 8-step change model. Now, he introduced, after a lot of studies and research, and proposed a framework which basically consists of 8 steps, and they are broadly divided into 3 parts. Now, he suggested there are a number of factors which are common, which organizations need to look at before they actually start implementing change within the organization, and to ensure that change is acceptable by the employees and staff and everybody within the organization. And he categorized, his model is called the John Cotter's change model, and it's an 8-step model. Basically 3 broad perspectives. One is creating the climate for change, then enabling the organization so that everyone in the organization engages to embrace that change. And a third is implementing after the change has been implemented, sustaining and, making sure that the change is adapted and, is basically embraced by all. So creating a climate, engaging in, enabling the organization to adapt to that change, and finally sustaining that change is what he proposed in his particular framework. The next one that we look at is Kurt Levin's model. He suggested a 3-step model essentially for introducing change within the organization. He was a German immigrant who moved to America in the 1930s, and he's called the founder of social psychology. And his interest was to understand how humans actually embrace change. How do they undergo the process of change? And if they undergo the process of change, what are the steps they go through which they embrace this change? So he came out with his own model and framework, and it is very widely accepted now today in the modern context of change management. And he basically proposed 3 steps: unfreeze, change, and then refreeze. So basically what he meant was that if you have to look at introducing change into the organization, you have to go through these 3 stages of unfreezing, basically doing the change, and then refreezing, so that those changes which have been done in the organization can then be adapted, and there is no going back to the old processes, because the freezing of that has happened. That means the new changes which have been implemented have overtaken or superseded the previous processes, and that is where it means that it has been freezed, or it has now taken effect. So his three-step model talks about implementation of change, and this is theoretical, that you need to be able to understand that what are the methods which are used by organizations, people within the organization, and they can be then used as models and frameworks to implement change in any part of the organization, even in IT. So when you do a change in, say, for example, in this case, very briefly, looking at if an organization is looking at changing the PCs and or upgrading the PCs to Windows 10, first thing they will do is unfreeze. That means they will identify, create a bit of a program, an implementation plan, identify which department they're going to start off with, what PCs are going to be, changed or upgraded or replaced, and that is all done in the unfreezing part of the plan. And that's the first step. Then the actual plan is to basically then get into that change. So that means orders have been already placed, PCs start arriving, trainings which have to be done for employees which need to understand the upgrades and start using the new software is all done within the stage of change, wherein the transition is actually happening. And that tends to be the second stage. And the third one tends to be when the changes have implemented, the old hardware has been taken out, the training has been completed, and or everybody is now happy or has at least got adapted to the new systems which have been given to them. And that would mean that refreezing of that has happened, so that for the next 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, the organization is not looking at going back to the old hardware or old processes or old systems. And in this case, they then take this refreezing allows as a third step or a stage 3 to establish the change has now been made, and people have to now become comfortable with the changes and then get on with the process of working. Now, last but not the least, the last criteria 3.5 talks about explaining the considerations to make when adapting to new technologies. Now, what are the basic things that an IT manager, an IT administrator, network engineer, somebody who's heading the department needs to take into consideration when they're adapting to emerging technologies? So when you look at the word emergent or emerging, what is that? What is the meaning of that word? And the reason I put this across here is that when you look at emerging means it's the process of coming into, or there are new things being brought into. There is something coming. There is a new beginning happening, emerging. And when we look at, emerging technologies being adapted, that means they are going to become a norm. That means they're going to be becoming something which is going to be used on a day in, day out basis. And becoming means that they are coming into existence. That means they're already there now. It is going into mass consumerization. It is being adopted by people, or people are starting to buy that. And that is where it means adapting to emerging technologies. That means deployment. So the IT word that we would normally use in this case would be, how do we deploy the new technologies in the organization? So this context of 3.5 actually talks about explaining the consideration, which means explain the considerations which are used or are looked into while deploying newer technologies within the organization. Now here, some of the examples, what you have to do is basically explain how do organizations actually adopt new technology. So when we talk about this, what we need to be able to do is basically talk about certain aspects of how the technology is integrated into the organization. So a new server being brought in, or a new domain, or a new website being launched. If some part of the IT side of things is being outsourced to an organization, how would this deployment actually work within the organization? So here, in one or two slides, what I've used is basically an example of service-oriented architecture, SOA. And what I've done is, using that example, I've explained how SOA can be used within the organizations to make the existing solutions or technology that they deploy scalable. So one example would be that today you have servers and infrastructure within the office. There's an IT room or a server room. Then over a point in time, as the need increases, and because of the change in requirement in the market right now, most companies are now investing into what are called cloud-based computing. So what you don't want to do is do away with the entire server and the server setup that you have in the office. But if there are requirements for you to add and introduce new infrastructure, some part of that would be done by adapting to emerging technology. That means the company would look at taking cloud-based space rather than looking at taking physical and virtual space within the office to expand the IT or the server side of room. And the reason why that would happen is, if data on cloud is generally more secure. If there's a fire in the office, or if you shift office, there is a cost of moving things over. And when we look at all these costs from a short-term perspective, they all add up to costs which the company is spending on the IT side of things. But if the servers are on the cloud, whether you move an office, whether there's a fire in the office, or if there's an upgrade which has to be done, all of these things are virtually and remotely done possible much more efficiently and quickly than physically upgrading that hardware within the office. So in those cases, you look at where companies which are basically call center based, website businesses, or basically customer services organizations, they are adapting to what are called the service oriented architecture, which means everything pretty much is on the cloud. And in those cases, if they have to expand, downsize, increase, or upgrade, those things are easily manageable because the technology that they deploy in terms of adapting to new technology is scalable. And that is the example, or a similar example needs to be cited here to explain this particular assessment criteria, which allows you to understand that how adapting to new technologies, is important and what considerations can be taken. I'll give you another example of considerations which you normally keep in mind. Sometimes as an IT department and as a manager or working within the IT, you look at always experimenting and, trialing out new technologies. But you go to a version of technology, or the trial actually starts because what you want to do is see how it works, what are the nuances or problems it can create, what are the issues which crop up, and to a certain extent, is the technology scalable? Is this going to be upgradable? When I say scalable, is it going to be something which is going to be, working across the platform? So all IT managers actually grapple with this when they look at taking on budgets and, getting it signed off by the managers to say, okay, this is something that we need to do. And as a manager, what they look at is, okay, you're asking us to introduce this or take on this or spend money on this. What are the benefits that we are going to realize as an organization? And in those cases, when we talk in the IT sense, we talk about things like upgrade, scalability, what are the releases which are going to happen, and how soon these releases would make the hardware side of things redundant or maybe not workable. Would this work across platforms? So if you have Windows, Macs, what will they work on tablet, PCs, Macs, and things like that? And what are the support criteria being provided by the company? How long are they going to support? What are the service level agreements? And in some cases, what could be the security issues which come out if the compatibility is not there, or if the updates are not installed, things like that. And those are the bits that you will look at looking at deploying or getting into when you look at considering adapting new technologies. So there are some additional reading which I would suggest, and I've uploaded the documents on Moodle. One is implementing new technology, which is an article on Harvard Business Review. And there is a case study, which is the rapid technological change which are happening in developing countries like Tanzania. And here there is a report which I've presented, which is a government report, essentially quite a elaborate document, but you could read first few pages in the introduction to familiarize yourself with how a governmental, how an organization which is basically managed by the government looks at embracing or introducing and deploying technological change in the organization. And then there's an article on Forbes, which I picked out, which basically talks about how change management is used and how changes can be introduced within the organization. And these articles, which are additional reading, would allow you to crystallize and understand this particular learning outcome that we've covered today in a bit more detail. So at this stage, what I would do is ask, and invite questions. If there are any questions you would want to ask, please feel free to ask me via chat, email, and we will catch up, and go through the next session, which will be looking at covering learning outcome 4. So thanks so much for listening and joining, and bye for now.